Why is objectivity seen as a good thing in psychology? Well, I'll tell you in this video. If you study psychology, you'll learn very early on that objectivity is important and that it's a good thing. You'll be told that if you're a researcher or a practitioner in psychology, you should remain value-free. This means you must remain completely unbiased. You mustn't allow your personal feelings, your assumptions, or your life experience to impact your work, because if you do that, it will mean you're being subjective, and being subjective is bad. That's in general what you'll learn when you study psychology. There are parts of psychology that teach something different, such as when you study qualitative methods, or in fields such as critical psychology, or in postgraduate levels when you're doing counselling or clinical psychology. In those spaces, objectivity can be commonly viewed as both undesirable and unattainable, and subjectivity is viewed as beneficial. But in the main body of psychology, particularly undergraduate level, you'll mostly be told that objectivity is good and subjectivity is bad. Why is objectivity seen by so much of psychology as a good thing? Well, because mainstream psychology mostly operates in a knowledge paradigm called positivism, and that paradigm has historically been the one adopted by the natural sciences, biology, chemistry, and the like. And a large amount of the training in psychology is focused on developing student skills and becoming that sort of a scientist that works in a laboratory, measures things with numerical scales, all that stuff. What is the positivist knowledge paradigm? Well, positivism tells us that the world exists independently from us, and that the only way we can come to understand the world is by observing it. And that act of observation is called a posteriori. I've been practicing that. Wait, I'll have a go. A posteriori. That's it. Nailed it, I think. Anyway, it's Latin for reasoning based on the observation of past events. That's where the word positivism comes from, posteriori. And the whole premise here is that we understand the world through observing events with an assumption that those events have taken place and will continue to take place without us being there to observe them. So does a tree make a sound if it falls in a forest when no one's there to hear it? Positivism says yes, 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 it does. The world exists independently of us. We don't need to be there to know that it's happened. But positivism does recognize that we can influence the world, we can act upon it. You know, if we were in that forest, maybe we'd try to stop the tree from falling down. But positivism would say that the moment we intervene, our observations become impure, because rather than clear, unadulterated knowledge about the world, we obtain a messy, smelly type of knowledge that is part world, part us. And therefore positivism insists that we should do everything we can to make sure we don't influence the thing that we're observing, that we remain objective. But this view of the importance of objectivity is not contained to a scientific paradigm. It's also found in notions about professional norms. The authority of a profession, in the West in particular, is often expressed by the ability of the profession and its members to adopt a neutral, detached, and dispassionate approach to its subject matter. So a professional journalist is one that reports objectively. But this norm of objectivity has been criticized as being little more than a veil for power, a set of norms that are invoked to maintain the social power of a profession by misdirecting public attention away from how that profession does things out of self-interest, such as creating monopolies over certain bodies of knowledge, which are then used to promote the social and economic interests of the members of the profession. For example, making psychological knowledge something that's incomprehensible to the public, such that psychologists can then be paid for dispensing psychological knowledge in the form of expensive therapeutic practice. And the university is a part of that project of creating disciplinary monopolies. As a university is that place where people are recruited into those professions, and that recruitment involves selecting provisional members and instilling in them the behavioral norms required to maintain the profession's authority. That's why you see this focus on objectivity coming at you from multiple directions when you're studying psychology at university. You get it coming from psychology and more broadly from the university as a whole, because it's instilled in these professional norms. But this focus on objectivity comes from places beyond that too. And that's because positivism is seated within a broader set of cultural assumptions that are commonly referred to as individualism. And this asserts that people exist as separate entities, separate from each other and separate from the world in which they live. It asserts that we are all independent and autonomous agents. And the idea of objectivity relies on that cultural assumption, because it's that assumption that makes it appear possible that we can place a distance between ourselves and the things that we observe, whether that be a person or something else that exists out there in the world. It leads us to believe that we can detach ourselves from the world and from other people in the world. And that's the worldview that most psychology students in the West are socialized into, a knowledge system known as positivism, seated in the norms of professionalism that in turn is seated in a culture of individualism. And one effect of this is that psychology students come out of their training believing objectivity is good and subjectivity is bad, and they rarely get much of a chance to seriously question those beliefs. And this is actually a big problem. Actually, it's 3 big problems, and I'll go through these 3 big problems. Problem number 1. These days, students come from many different cultural backgrounds, and not all students come in with similarly strong-held cultural assumptions that we call individualism. Some of our students, particularly students from Asia and Africa, have been socialized into practices associated with more collectivist cultures. Also, within countries that are strongly associated with an individualistic culture, such as Australia and the US, there are groups in those countries who have a more collectivist culture. This is particularly true for many First Nations people, but we have students who come from social classes where collectivism has been historically more pronounced, such as from working class backgrounds. That's my background. In a collectivist culture, you're more likely to believe that people are interconnected to each other and to the world in which we all live. Objectivity is a bit more of a strange concept in that context. Students who've been socialized into a set of norms and behaviors reflective of a more collectivist culture might find it harder to get their heads around the concept of objectivity, and they might find it tough trying to think and behave like an individualistically minded psychologist while remaining faithful to their own culture. Problem number 2. Psychology is often grouped in with the social sciences, and it's seldom grouped in with the natural sciences. So at university, you often find psychology sitting in a faculty of the social sciences and humanities, and you seldom find it in a faculty of medicine or a faculty of the natural sciences. And as such, psychology often occupies a discipline space alongside professions that are much less dominated by positivism and that are more critically reflective of the impact of cultural assumptions on how we think about science and knowledge. Disciplines like sociology, for example. And the social sciences and humanities often intersect with disciplines in the creative arts. In fact, there are lots of important intersections between the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts. And that's where you find, in that very space, that's where you find psychology often sitting. And it often sits there really quite awkwardly, because of its almost total adherence to this idea that objectivity is good and subjectivity is bad. That idea puts it at odds with the disciplinary space it occupies. In the arts, the subjectivity of the artist is integral to the art they create, and the subjectivity of the audience is integral to how that art is understood. Objectivity is seen as delusional and, at worst, a form of nihilism, a denial of the essentially subjective nature of existence. Life is lived as a subjective experience, and people who adhere to this notion of objectivity, kind of in these in the spaces in the creative arts, it can be seen as a denial of life. So psychology is out of place in the very place you often find it because of its adherence to the notion that we should promote objectivity. And psychology stagnates as a result of it not being able to find nourishment from the setting it most often finds itself in. The third problem, the final one I'm going to talk about in this video, to try and keep it reasonably short. It's over 10 minutes already. So, this third and final problem. This one follows on from that second problem about psychology being more often housed in the social sciences in spite of it often thinking of itself as a natural science. Undergraduate students are often attracted to psychology because they're drawn to this area of the social sciences, the humanities and the arts. These are students who are mostly not fascinated by test tubes, genome sequencing, dissecting rats and the like, though some of our students do love that stuff. But more typically, psychology students are more focused on working with people in social settings. They typically exhibit the ambitions and preferences we associate with social science and humanities students. And as such, many undergraduate students can get confused and disillusioned when they find that psychology actually operates more like a natural science. Lots of maths, lots of biology, lots of time in laboratories, not much focus on people skills. Now, traditionally, there has not been much focus on people skills in undergraduate psychology because people skills are social skills that require the skillful, subjective engagement with others. It's not really until you get into postgraduate programs like clinical or counselling psychology. For example, if you're working in a counselling or psychotherapeutic setting, it's often seen as deeply unhelpful to strive to maintain this objective position towards your client. Now, some people in clinical and counselling do believe in objectivity, but you can often find people who disagree with it. They will say that the people who object to objectivity will say that the trick with counselling is not to make an objective evaluation of your client, but to try to empathise with your client, whilst recognising that you're responding to them in the way you do because of the things you've gone through in your own life. And above all, it's about recognising that your client is subjectively making sense of what's happening to them, and that you are, in turn, subjectively responding to their sense-making. You can't form empathy without understanding how meaning is made through our subjective engagement with the world and other people in it. In a word, there are a number of people, including me, who believe that you can't be a good counsellor or a clinical psychologist unless you understand the importance and the value of subjectivity and know how to be a skillful, reflective practitioner. The problem is that many of our students don't make it into those postgraduate programs because they either drop out before finishing their degree or end up not getting a high enough grade in their degree, perhaps because they're doing maths when really they're more of an arts or humanities type student. Now, things are changing. They're changing in psychology, such that we see qualitative methods in psychology is being brought into undergraduate programs, and that can open up more room for students to engage positively with subjectivity. But progress here in Australia on all of this stuff has been really, really slow. Now, given all these problems, why has psychology held objectivity to be so important to it, even though it causes problems in how it can be translated cross-culturally, how it causes problems as in the disciplinary space it often occupies, and how unhelpful it is to how we relate to people? Well, this adherence to objectivity is largely because since the early 1900s, psychology has sought to become a natural science. It has in particular sought to emulate the biological sciences and to align with medicine. And that should lead you to your next key question. Why has psychology done that? Well, that one is not for this video because this is getting long. That's for another video. And if you want that video, you just let me know. So, let's finish this one. Till next time. Ta-da.